Good day, everyone. My name is Frank Montero, and I want to welcome you all to today's webinar on broadcasting during the times of emergency. Fletcher, Hildreth is doing this webinar in conjunction with the Florida Association of Broadcasters, and I want to turn it over to my very good dear friend, Pat Roberts, the CEO of the Florida Association of Broadcasters, who's going to get us started, and then we'll introduce the today's panel. Pat?
Frank, I want to thank you and Davina and everybody in your law firm for helping put this together. We're going to take a more global view today. This is not so much about details of our state plan, but more of a global view of EAS. We've got a great panel group today. I also want to welcome, so that the people from Florida know, we reached out to Puerto Rico and our friends in Louisiana and Mississippi to ask them to join us. As you know, we've all had hurricanes, including the Pensacola area, but Louisiana's been hit. So welcome from the other states and from Puerto Rico. I just want to thank everybody. I've been involved with the State Emergency Communication Committee since about 1989, 1990. And I've served now the third time on the CISRIC councils that were set up after 9/11. So I've worked closely with Lisa and her staff, and they're doing an excellent job. We also, besides having Lisa from Homeland Security running that bureau at the FCC, we've got Craig Fugate, an old friend who ran Florida Emergency Management and then ran for Obama. So he worked for Jeb Bush and for Obama. So he's an interesting guy who really knows emergency management. He'll give perspectives, but you know, Florida really became more modern after Hurricane Andrew, 1992. We started putting in a statewide system in 93. Craig took it to another level when he took over emergency management. So I think it's great to get everybody. Today's group, mainly, we've got over 100 people signed up. Mainly it's going to be engineers, but we do have some of our executive committee, board members and other members. I want to thank all of them for helping us in putting this together. FAB has an extremely strong board, and our executive committee is outstanding. I want to thank their help. And then I will now let Frank, you can kind of kick it off and we will get rolling. We're going to do our best to be done between an hour and a half. We'll be wrapping up, but thank all of you and thank the panelists.
Thank you, Pat. I really appreciate that. And we have a great lineup here for us today. Pat, you know, was being very modest. In addition to his hat as the head of the Florida Broadcasters, was also been the chairman of the State Emergency Communications Committee, as well as chairing the FCC's Security, Reliability, and Interoperability Council's working group. So he brings a lot of knowledge and information about the issue of emergency broadcasting, and we're going to be tapping into some of that knowledge at the very end. But for right now, I'd like to echo Pat in welcoming the Florida broadcasters that are with us, as well as the Puerto Rico broadcasters, Louisiana and Mississippi. It's been a particularly tough hurricane season for all of you, and I hope everybody out there is doing well and is safe, to say nothing, of course, of the pandemic and COVID and having to deal with those weather emergencies in the midst of a pandemic. Must be incredibly challenging. I have with me today my law partner, Davina Sashkin, who is actually coming to us from Austin, Texas, where she works from our Austin branch office out there. And she's going to be speaking with me over some of the overview issues that we're going to be talking about, and with a particular focus, Davina will, on some of the FCC initiatives. In addition to that, I want to welcome our very, very special guests that have agreed to come here with us today. And we're very, very privileged to have both Lisa Folks and Christina Clearwater, who are the chief and deputy chief, respectively, of the SEC's Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau. We're very, very happy to have you both with us, and they're going to be telling us a little bit about what their bureau is doing and a take on some of these larger issues. And likewise, we're very, very fortunate to have Craig Fugate with us, former FEMA administrator, and now the owner and principal of Craig Fugate Consulting, and someone who has spoken at the Florida broadcasters before, and likewise brings a wealth of knowledge on these important issues. This webinar is the latest in a series of webinars that our firm has put together with the Florida broadcasters and with other state broadcast associations. And if you are interested in seeing some of the prior webinars that we have done, we do have a YouTube page. Just go onto YouTube and search Fletcher, Hildreth webinar. You'll find a wide variety of webinars there on FCC public inspection file setups, political broadcasting, license renewals. We even have marijuana advertising, EEO, the list goes on and on, copyright, music royalties. So there's a lot of information there for you, for your general managers, a lot of engineering issues as well touched there. So please feel free to tap into that wealth of information. And lastly, we also have a blog, as you can see on the screen here, calmlawblog.com. I invite you all to subscribe. It's free, and it will give you almost daily updates on what's going on at the FCC, rule changes and rule developments and more. Last one, a bit of housekeeping, which is that in this format, you'll see it's a little different than Zoom. We will be having a question and answer period at the end. We anticipate that our entire presentation itself should not last more than about an hour or maybe 70 minutes. But then we're going to leave a little bit of time at the end, maybe 15, 20 minutes for questions and answers if anybody has any. The entire program will not run more than 90 minutes. So by 1:30, if you're on Eastern Daylight Savings Time, by 1:30 this afternoon, we'll be done. That's including question and answers. And if you want to ask questions, the way it's done is that there should be a little pull-down menu on your screen. You'll see a tab called questions. You type your questions, and at the end, we will read those questions aloud to the panelists and answer them online. So you don't have to unmute yourself or anything like that. That's really the protocol here. So today's agenda is going to cover, we're going to start with sort of a general overview of EAS requirements, and then we're going to do, Davina's going to later jump into some of the SEC requirements, including EAS fogs and tests. And then we're going to throw it over to Craig, who's going to talk to us a little bit about DHS and assistance for broadcasters from DHS and FEMA. And then we're going to, last but not least, going over to Lisa and Christina, who are going to talk to us a little bit about what the FCC has been doing. They've been, as many of you know, extraordinarily helpful to broadcasters over the years as far as making their office and their facilities available to broadcasters during difficult times. I always remember your involvement after Maria as well, and you guys were just phenomenal, to say nothing of Katrina. And then we're going to do a little wrap up at the end on some of the state issues with Pat before taking questions and answers. So next slide, Joe. As many of you already know, the EAS system is largely functions almost like a calling tree system. There are primary entry point stations that are designated, and these stations are national primary stations, which then distribute presidential messages or other messages to other broadcast stations and cable systems. They do that with emergency action notification alerts. That's going to be an important issue as we talk a little bit later on. And then those distribute messages from the president or his designee and alert everyone that a message from the president or designee is about to come over the EAS system using the PEP system. EAS alerts have to be initiated by a trusted source or originator. That would, obviously in the case of a national emergency, be the President of the United States or their designee, the National Weather Service. The state, in the case of Florida, would be the Florida Emergency Operations Center or state law enforcement. They can also be activated by local, county, and tribal governments. Lisa made a point of making sure that we mentioned that. With Amber Alerts, those can be activated by the Center for Missing and Exploited Children, but they have to be approved by the state law enforcement agency before going out. And then most recently, the FCC has added Blue Alerts, with an event code of BLU. And these are for threats to law enforcement, and they function like Amber Alerts do for missing children. And those broadcasters were required to implement those in 2019. Next slide, Joe. EAS participants, like yourselves, have to deliver, this is mandatory, presidential alerts and nationwide, monthly, and weekly tests. The tests for delivery of other types of alerts, like say weather, state, or amber, are done voluntarily. Stations are not required to air local emergency messages, and EAS alerts have to be accessible to people with disabilities. And we're going to talk about that in a little more detail as well. EAS alerts are delivered to the participants over either the internet from FEMA's iPause gateway. We're going to talk a little bit about iPause, or over the air by over-the-air broadcast. EAS is part of the iPause national system for local alerting with local authenticated emergency alerts and information messaging through the broadcast stations, cable, and by mobile and internet apps using the wireless emergency alerts. As I mentioned, it functions like a calling tree, trickling out. Next slide, Joe. EAS participants are required to monitor both the iPause system as well as over-the-air broadcasts. The iPause system does offer digital sound, full enhanced text messaging, audio announcements, and the like. So it's a more robust system. But you should be monitoring both. EAS activation interrupts the programming once. The emergency message or audio text is repeated twice, and then regular programming continues. The displays can vary, especially visual displays on TV screens. And again, Davina's going to be talking a little bit more about that. Next slide. So now I'd like to turn the presentation over to my colleague, Davina Sashkin, who's going to dive down a little bit more into some of the specifics of how the FCC gets involved with the EAS system and some of the obligations and requirements there. Davina?
Thanks, Frank. So as Frank was saying, we're just going to give, the details of what the rules are and how they apply, just to make sure we're all on the same page. And then as we get into some of the more, pressing issues about what's going on in the world around us, we'll have all that framework with us. So as Frank mentioned, broadcast stations, of course, are supposed to monitor both the iPause feed as well as over-the-air broadcast stations pursuant to your state plan. There will be what's called an LP1 and an LP2, which would be your primary over-the-air broadcast station to be either you are one or you are listening to one, and you get that alert directly over the air from that station. It's a relay system, and so it relies on, the whole EAS system relies on everybody listening to each other so that those alerts can be relayed through the system. In addition to that, of course, everyone has to send and receive at least one test alert, a test or alert each week. You also are required to retransmit a monthly test within 60 minutes of receipt. Again, these are all going to be specific to your state plan. All stations must retransmit immediately any national level alerts. And, I think that should go without saying, right? If there's a national level alert, things are really serious. So, be on it. And then, of course, EAS alerts must be oral for all radio stations, clearly, and visual if you're a TV station. And if you're a TV station, your visual part of your alert is a fixed text page. And it's a video crawl at the top of the screen where it will not interfere with other visual messages. All stations have to maintain and save a record of all the tests and alerts received. This is what we talk about when we talk about your logs. Hey, Joe, let's go ahead and move ahead.
Davina, before we go on to, I've got a question, which is, and this is not just for you, maybe for Lisa, Christina, Pat, anybody here. Let's say I'm a new broadcaster, just bought a station in Florida. I'm getting myself set up here. How do I know, is there a place where I go to find out what station I should be listening to, what the primary origination station should be? Where are the resources that a new station owner can have to tap into to find out?
I'm gonna actually throw this to Pat, if I get Pat in on this. Pat, who do they contact about in Florida for the state plan and to determine who their LP1 and LP2s are?
It's posted on our website. And as Lisa knows, they're doing great. They're running a little behind in Washington, getting the new plans updated. We've submitted some revisions because, we have 11 big markets. So, but yeah, they've done a great job. They can go to our website, fab.org. The Florida Association of Broadcasters, and they can then go there, click on EAS and click through and get all the way down to their operational area. And it's always a working document because of the changes of ownership, tower moving, stations moving. It's a challenge, but the plan's there. And if they've got questions, just write me at FAB. They can get that off the website too, and I'll be glad to jump on and get with them. We've got great local chairmen in every market, so.
Great.
I'll talk about this a little bit later, but all of the state plans are now available on the FCC's website.
Yes.
And the resources that Pat was talking about from the FAB are available in all the state associations. I'm an unashamed huge fan and proponent of the state broadcast associations. I think they provide huge resources to the stations with questions of this nature. So if you happen to be on the webinar and you're not a member of the FAB, or if you're in some other state, you're not a member of the association, I highly urge you to remember, because this is where
People that want to get off.
Frank, I would agree with you that the FCC's got it, but sometimes, and it's not, at least in all of them are working remote like we are. We haven't been in my office since March 13th. So we had to make some revisions to the Orlando area and a couple other markets because stations moved or ownership changes. So if you go to ours, it's the most accurate of who can be monitored while we wait for the FCC to get final approval. And they've been great working with them.
Thanks, Pat. It just occurred to me that we should take a quick step back if you're talking about, as Frank suggested, well, if I'm a brand new broadcaster, sort of where do I start? Well, the first thing you got to start with is you have to have an EAS encoder and decoder at your station.
Oh,
yeah. That is, and what it is to again drill down. So these this equipment, it's it as it sounds like it and can decode messages that come in and encode messages that go back out over the air for you. And what's important about these is now the FCC requires all stations to have internet enabled system, EAS equipment that can receive and monitor the iPause system. That was not something, gosh, I don't remember what year it was. Maybe it was 5 or 6 years ago that transition happened. Is that right, Lisa? Prior to that, it was simply over the air, and you had a system that was pretty old analog kind of systems, and now everything is required to be internet enabled and therefore also updates itself through software downloads and things like that. But you do need to kind of stay on top of it. Sometimes there's some little, kinks in those systems about having to, download updates and things like that. But that's what enables you to monitor both the iPods and the over-the-air systems.
Lisa, were you going to make a comment from earlier?
Yes, just wanted to say regarding the state EAS plan, so people can understand the process there really quickly, because Pat has commented on having to wait for our approval on things. State EAS plans, when they are first drafted or when there are changes made, the rules say have to be approved by the chief of the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau. And lo and behold, right now that's me. And the process for us is we do not rubber stamp whatever comes in as a state, as a new or an updated state EAS plan. Christina and her team take a lot of time to review those plans. Sometimes they have questions about the plans, which requires them to go back to the SCCCs and ask their questions. Sometimes we're asking for additional information. And so those are all things that can result in it taking longer than folks would like. And then when the staff reviews the drafts, they come to me. And being a lawyer, I never sign anything that I don't read first. So then you have the situation where I am also reviewing the plans to make sure that I agree with my staff's recommendation and that I'm comfortable approving it. In some cases, I'm being asked to sign them. So that's, in a nutshell, the process. We certainly are always looking for ways to be faster in our review. But I want you to know that Christina and the alerting team are reviewing these plans as fast as they can. I tend to have a 24-hour turnaround time when plans come to me. And so, if people have ideas on how we can make the process faster, by all means, let me or let Christina know, but we are very much working to get plans approved as quickly as possible.
And Frank, they're doing a great job. It is. There's 50 states in Puerto Rico and Guam, so it's not like there's one state out there.
understood, absolutely.
Great.
Go ahead.
So in addition to, of course, you have the things that you have to do, there's also things you need to avoid. And the big one, of course, is the false emergency alert. You may, hopefully you read trade press or you read our blog and you'll see that the FCC has and will fine stations for improper use of EAS tones or even unauthorized tone simulations when there's not an emergency. And the idea is that, you don't want to create a situation where the public ignores emergency alerts because they're there for a reason. They're there to actually provide important emergency information to the public, and you don't want to drown those important information alerts out by having uses of the tones in other settings.
You have to be really careful too, right? Because I think in some of these violations, it's been like in commercial advertisements.
Right. You have to be, in fact, quite a bit of them are. A number of them, I guess, in recent years, there was one where it was like a EAS tone in a promo for, I guess it was a 911 type program or something like that. And so it was in the promos. Well, the promos, of course, ran on, every station in the country multiple times. And so each time, you have an alert tone that runs that's not an emergency setting, each one of those instances is basis for a fine. And so, what we have here in the slide is that there was a recent proposed fine for $20,000 just for airing for 1 second. And then that's pretty small potatoes, actually, in a number of different scenarios in the last 5-6 years.
Whopper years ago, right?
They're $300,000 fines and up because it takes into account the number of individual transmissions, meaning, as in my example, where there's multiple promos over multiple days, over the number of people reached. So, is it, how many times did it happen? Was it over just one day, several days, months? Is how many people were potentially impacted? Was it a national situation? Was it regional, local? And then, of course, the extent of the public safety impact. I guess, Lisa, you can of course probably speak to it better than I can, but this is sort of an evaluation of how much this particular inappropriate use of the alert tone could have caused confusion or problems for the public.
Yeah, and if you're the station GM, if you're the station, even the GSM, I mean, you guys have to, review that ad copy to make sure that, in a Die Hard movie or something like that, somebody doesn't throw in an EAS tone just to be cute, because you're the one, the station, I mean, are the one that's going to get nailed for it if it slips through.
All right, Joe, you can go forward, please. So further requirements regarding bilingual EAS, right now that is not mandated. The commission has it under review. But we do have a requirement that EAS have to be accessible to those who are disabled. And so one of the ways is that you have to have the message when it's at a crawl on a television screen. It has to be on the top or elsewhere on the screen where it will not interfere with other visual messages. So often that's why you see the crawl at the top, or maybe I've seen them also sort of in the middle, actually. So that way, if there's anything at the bottom of the screen, sometimes programs, especially news, local news programs will have, news crawling at the bottom and the time and the weather, whatever. So you don't want to interfere with that. It has to be readily readable, understandable. You want to make sure your text is not overlapping itself. Of course, crawls can go off the screen. And the entire text of the EAS message has to be displayed at least once. With your audible crawl rule, TV broadcasters have to use the secondary audio stream to convey the televised message orally also, so that you can hear it. So people who are blind would be able to hear the message. And you don't have to do that in a newscast, although I think probably people just do it anyway. For the most part, it's just, and then that's not in effect yet. The deadline for that, for compliance widespread, is not until 2023. It's been extended. In my experience, I find that a lot of stations are already doing that, but you do not have to necessarily comply with that quite yet. Joe, you can advance ahead.
Davida, just real quick.
Yeah.
I know you don't know this, and I don't know if Lisa does, but Florida may be the only state that has ever done an actual Spanish yes message. Craig was head of emergency management. He and I were standing there with Governor Bush, and Hurricane Charlie stalled in the Gulf of Mexico, and Max Mayfield said, it's going to hit Fort Myers, it's not going to hit Tampa, but you've got a lot of migrant workers. So in a matter of 15 minutes, we put out an English message, and then we put out a Spanish message telling everybody to lock down. You had 2 minutes to an hour to get safe. So we've actually done it in Florida, and it wasn't a test. It was the real thing. 2004 Hurricane Charlie.
Look, as somebody who represents a lot of broadcasters who program primarily in Spanish language, I think it's terrific. I would love for that to be part of the plan going forward, but I'm not in charge. And there's a process underway at the commission, and so maybe we'll see that.
I know in Puerto Rico, and I know we have a lot of the Puerto Rico broadcasters there, they have set up their own system for being able to distribute the information, largely in Spanish down there for obvious reasons. So, but yeah, I mean, this is an issue that I think is ongoing, and at least I know this is one that you guys are continuing to look into.
So the last area, I think this is my last area, if I remember the slide. So it's EAS logs. We talked about that briefly before. So all of your weekly and monthly tests, as well as any actual alerts that go out, have to be logged. Usually the system that you're using, the equipment has a log function, so it's not like you're doing handwritten logs, although of course, if something were to go wrong, or you're under an actual emergency scenario, maybe you're operating an emergency power or something, if your system is for whatever reason not operating properly, then yes, please take a manual log. These logs have to be reviewed weekly and signed by your station's chief operator. You also need to make sure you have a written explanation if there was, when your weekly test comes through and you didn't get it. So you have an obligation to try to determine what happened. Was there a failure on your end? Was there a failure on the sender's end? What happened? It's not that you were necessarily in any kind of trouble about that, but you do have an obligation to try to figure out the problem, and therefore you can try to resolve it. So, as I mentioned about that, used to be there was printouts. Now you can have software that just automatically, updates. Sometimes they go to a cloud place. Sometimes they actually back up to your own system in your station. So you don't have to keep a printout. But you'll want to have proof of those required weekly tests, required monthly tests. And you have to make sure the logging both of your two sources being logged if they're different tests and alerts. Sometimes, for example, especially for stations that cover in a market that covers a wide area, sometimes you'll have an LP1 on this side of town, and then you have an LP2 on the other side of town, and an emergency alert, particularly for weather, will go out on one side of town that doesn't go out on the other. So you'll have different things happening. It's not that they're always going to be the same. And again, printing out is not an actual log for purposes of the FCC. If the FCC comes, anytime comes or asks for your log, it's not a log unless it is signed or initialed by your chief operator. And that is, again, on a weekly basis. So make sure to date that. All right, Joe, you can put fast forward. All right. So I think I'm kind of going to be moving ahead and handing over to Craig in this slide. Moving over again, I mentioned before that the FCC, in conjunction with FEMA, adopted this. It was for the iPOS, Modernization Act, that now requires a nationwide EAS test every 3 years. The last few years, they've been doing them every year since 2016. And you guys all probably remember it was typically in August, although I think a couple times it's been bumped to September, October because of the actual active storms interfering. And this year, of course, it was canceled because of COVID-19. To understand sort of what the point of these national tests is just to make sure the system works. I mean, the first time we did it, nobody knew if this new internet-enabled iPOS system was going to work and how that was going to work in conjunction with the over-the-air, legacy system. And as of last year, apparently now the daisy chain system of broadcast delivery is largely effective. We got 83% compliance and reach, and that's great. But I guess the idea is we want to get to 100%. So there will be another national EAS test next year.
Is the 2021 test still, as far as you know, still on schedule?
That I do not know. We're going to have a conversation with FEMA about that.
Okay.
I'm guessing it's just up in the air, considering we don't know what's happening with the pandemic, and we'll
That's right. Mm-hmm.
Well, watch this space, I guess, is the answer. But in the meantime, you got your required monthly and weekly tests that continue, and when you do have to do a nationwide test again, you would report your results on this electronic test reporting system, or ETRS, which is it's a little bit unique and quirky system if anybody's had to do it. Although I think now engineers in particular at stations have become much more accustomed to it, and they're able to fill out the reporting much more easily.
ETRS 2.
Is that what it's called now? I mean, I just know it as ETRS. And I guess this is really getting into weeds. We have on here what these header codes are. And the reason we wanted to bring those up is these header codes are in the nationwide alerts. There's one that's the nationwide alert header code is all zeros. And why that's important is, Craig, I don't know if you want to jump in now. Why did you guys adopt the zeros and the event codes that are different, and then how does that work when it's delivered to the stations?
Well, again, I'm not sure why it was all zeros, but the intent was to have a unique identifier that would trigger all of the equipment and have a standard code that the EPROMs and all the program encoders would recognize as an automatic transmit. All of the other messages allow you to put in a delay or a stop and allow you to review that before you either transmit it with a second delay or manually transmit it. But the national messages, the messages from the president or designee, were designed not to be delayed or interrupted. These are the absolute requirements. So they picked a header code so that all the manufacturers could build to that standard, that code must always go through regardless of what the station is selecting for their voluntary transmissions, which is everything else.
Great. And so what happened in the case of the 2018 missile attack to test scare was that, there was a local, EAS or local official in Hawaii that was doing what they call, an unannounced test. And they used this code, and then that just triggered all of the equipment, right? Correct.
Well, one of the things that we saw with that was a lot of things went wrong, but the most important thing that we're trying to address in our committee working group as part of the current CISRIC is, one, how do you minimize that? And two, how do you make sure there's a recall process? That was two things we saw happen. One, they actually used an actual launch code instead of a test. And two, there was not an effective recall. That message was out there for a rather long period of time before Hawaiian Civil Defense even acknowledged that they had sent out the message in error. And a lot of the stations were confused because they couldn't immediately find out, is this a mistake? Is this an actual event? And so that's one of the things that CISRIC has really been trying to focus on in this go round is how do we minimize the false alerts? And more importantly, if one does happen, how do we get that corrected quickly? And this is why broadcasters are such a key role of this, of knowing your local emergency managers, knowing that relationships on a day-to-day basis, not just something that you're going through FAB and Pat's handled it, and you don't need to know the local emergency managers. Because what we saw in Hawaii was if people could have picked up the phone and gotten through to the people that originated that, that could have probably been stopped much quicker. The fact that it was out there for so long and now it's being picked up nationally caused a lot more stress on the system. Then, yeah, it was a mistake. We corrected it. We retransmitted a correction. We called all our partners, pulled this down. None of that happened fast enough. And that's one of the things we've been trying to address in the CISRIC process is how to minimize that.
And now the FCC requires
Remind us
you
what
to.
CISRIC stands for?
CISRIC is the Communication Reliability, I'll get it wrong, Communication Security Reliability Infrastructure Committee.
Right.
Okay.
And both Pat and I are chairing subcommittees. He had the broadcasters. I had the working group that was the focused on the false alerts and the processes with the emergency managers and the broadcasters and other providers of the signal.
Great.
Now the FCC requires you to give notification if there has been a test using the actual event codes or that sort of thing. I mean, you have to sort of disseminate the information, and you have to make a report on that. I think it's within 24 hours. And likewise, the FCC is now also requiring that if you inadvertently air a false EAS tone, which is different from an EAS test, but just an inappropriate false use of an EAS tone, that you're supposed to give notification of that immediately as well.
Yeah, this goes back to a best practice that the FCC sent back out to everybody. We had people breaking into your encoder boxes because when you got them, you never changed the default passwords. And we started seeing zombie alerts and other things going out across your boxes. So remember, one of the things you always want to make sure is when you upgrade or get new equipment is reset the default passwords to something unique. That became another way we saw false alerts coming into the system, that people had not protected their equipment from people getting into it and then inadvertently or unintentionally sending out false messages.
Next slide, Joe. I'm going to just jump in here for a second on some of these points and also throw it back over to Craig. A big sea change here came in 2018, Craig, as you know, when broadcasters were named first responders officially, and that opened up a lot of doors for them. In fact, Pat and the FAB paid kudos to them, playing a huge role in getting broadcasters that designation. And that first responder designation, Craig, right, opens up a lot of privileges for broadcasters in terms of, access to generator fuel, the DHS letters that broadcasters can now have to have access to fuel and debris removal. And you guys had developed something while you were FEMA director called the Waffle House Index. Craig, why don't you tell us a little bit about some of these benefits that broadcasters get, as well as some of your experiences?
Well, what the Appropriation Act finally did was something that we did in Florida the whole time. And that is, you have to understand the role of broadcasters in disasters. Now, we've talked about a lot of requirements, but I want to really focus in on why being on the air is so critical. Everybody has these. And for a lot of people, they think streaming and the internet and everything like that, which are great tools before disaster happens, will be up and running after disaster. And what we have found too many times, whether it was Hurricane Michael, the Panhandle, whether it was Hurricane Maria across Puerto Rico, the VI, the wildfires in California, Napa, and others, these only work when there's power and cell coverage. And when they go out, you go into an information vacuum. In Hurricane Andrew, we coined the term for most of the survivors. All they knew was as far as they could see, as far as they could walk. And the only way to get information in 1992 and in 2020 in many of these communities is through broadcasters. And so the emphasis that we had was getting a broadcaster on the air or keeping a broadcaster on the air was a key part of keeping the public informed in a disaster. When you talk to survivors, the first days obviously are just about search and rescue and trying to get somewhere safe and shelter. But one of the things that we've heard from people that in the days that follow, lack of information, not even knowing if the rest of the world knows how bad it is, not getting any news. And most recently in Hurricane Michael in the Florida Panhandle, this was a phenomenon from the coast all the way up into Southwest Georgia. The only information people could get was from actually FM radio stations. In many cases, even if the TVs were broadcasting, they had no power. And that's why the other best practice that came out of Florida was working with radio stations and TV stations that have newsrooms to be prepared to simulcast. So what we actually did in 2018 was actually acknowledge that as far as infrastructures go, as much as people focus on power and water and other things, communications is the most important, most immediate need to be met. And that's the unique role that broadcasters have. It's not only just being able to provide the emergency alert messages, it's being on the air after the disaster. And this was really borne out, down in the VI in Puerto Rico. If those stations weren't on the air, entire parts of the country had no other there was no internet, there was no Wi-Fi, there was no power, the roads were out. And the only way they could even find out what was going on was being able to tune to those radio stations. So what we had done in Florida was recognize that everything from getting your crews in and out of curfew areas to getting fuel. If Pat remembers in 2005 with Hurricane Wilma, we were dealing both with widespread power outages, but Port Everglades, which is the primary provider of fuel in South Florida, was out. They were closed because of the storm. And we actually had stations running on fumes about to go off the air. And we coordinated with FAB. We prioritized getting the fuel there to keep them on the air. So I think what we saw in 2018 is really just acknowledging that even if you are a commercial operation, we should be able to support that to get you on the air. Now, this isn't talking about the commercial ventures. This isn't a loan program or anything like that. This is about getting you on the air or keeping you on the air as a critical point of information. So as you go through these examples, these are things that we had been doing at the state level. It was always a question, would FEMA reimburse local governments for this? Would they reimburse states for it? And our experience in 2004, 2005, when they pushed back, was this is essential communication in disaster. And it's part of the emergency public information. And that is how we did that. But the designations as a first responder is also an important thing, because when we started seeing the COVID governments at state and local level beginning to shut down certain activities, there was a lot of questions. Well, how will this affect broadcasters? And I think it was important that FEMA and DHS identified broadcasters as essential workers. And again, I know a lot of stations, they did social distancing, particularly in their sales and newsroom staff, but being able to get engineers in and get out to your sites were important, because as people broadly interpreted that, the question was, well, can we even go into our workplace? Can we at least go to our transmitters? Can we stay on the air? And it's an absolute yes, because you're part of that emergency public information process. So as we went through that, it was, you know, again, a long-standing relationship that we had in Florida with the FCC. We obviously lose stations in the area of impact, particularly with hurricanes, but the ability for stations to redirect, increase power, to be able to get signal back in. All of this is really something I think each of the state associations, working with their state emergency management agency, really, this is where it happens. FEMA is more of a support role. And the thing I would tell you about all the support from FEMA is you're probably not going to go directly to FEMA to get it. You're going to your state and local officials. What FEMA is going to be doing is reimbursing it, or in the case where the state doesn't have the resources or can't get to it, prioritizing resources FEMA is bringing in. But that assistance will be directed by your state. So if I cannot overemphasize this, and Pat will reinforce this, the relationship between your state association and that state emergency management office are going to be key for coordinating these programs and resources. And then the last one was the Waffle House. Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. No, finish. I want to hear about the Waffle House. But then I want to ask Pat a question.
The Waffle House is something that came out of the 2004 and 2005 hurricane seasons. And it's a little bit of a story about a company, but also about how to do a quick look at a community and severity of impacts. We were noticing that if there was anything open in some of the more devastated areas, particularly after Hurricane Charlie and later through the other 4 hurricanes, if there was anything going to be open, it was going to be a Waffle House. And we had started color coding our counties using a stoplight of red, yellow, and green to talk about everything from power outages to school closings. And the idea was red was bad, yellow was, it's impactful, but we're managing. And green was, it's either not that bad or they can manage it themselves. And why this was important was we had so many counties at different stages of impacts that we needed some way to triage the prioritization of resources. And so that red, yellow, and green was being used throughout the storms. But Waffle House was also getting open and doing things that, quite frankly, we were just amazed at. And again, if there was anything open, it was a Waffle House. And so we kind of adapted our red, yellow, and green to the Waffle House status. And if the Waffle House was closed because of the disaster, that was red. That's bad, because Waffle House has a very simple disaster operational mission, and that is get open. And so if they're closed, it's because they can't get open or they've had to evacuate and haven't gotten back yet. If they are open but have a limited menu, that was yellow. And again, this could be everything from boiled water orders to power outages. But what we saw again was if the structure of the Waffle House was inherently safe, they would figure out a way to get open, whether it was bringing a generator, whether it was to implement their protocols if they were in their boiled waters or had no water. But they would often get open with a very limited menu, generally things they had just brought in from the warehouses. And so that was yellow. And if the Waffle House was green and had a full menu, that's green. It doesn't mean there's not impacts, but it means that, think about it. They got water, they got potable water, employees can get to work, which means roads are open, and that they can get customers in there. It doesn't mean that things haven't been impacted, but it's a quick way of looking at infrastructure and just looking at the status of one item, a restaurant. The fact that they're open and serving a full menu tells me a lot about the impacts there. And if it's closed, that also tells me the severity, because if the Waffle House can't get open because of the storm or the damages, that's telling me I got a lot of infrastructure problems. I got a lot of debris problems. They can't get to the store for a variety of reasons. And that in between helps me start identifying the areas that transition from the absolute crisis areas to the areas that can probably manage on their own in the beginning, and most likely are going to need, you know, whatever assistance will be primarily financial after the disaster. So that was the idea of the Waffle House. And to a certain degree, I can apply this to broadcasters. You know, if you're off the air, you're red. If you are on the air, but you don't have content, you don't have personnel, you can't get news out there, you're not providing emergency public information, you're probably yellow. And if you can do on the air, you are broadcasting, you've got your personnel, you've got content, because those are kind of the three things. You got to have a signal, you got to have your personnel, and you got to have contact. You're green. Doesn't mean there's not impacts, but for every station that's off the air, that's a red condition, because that's one more information source that people can't get. And sometimes it may only be the one surviving station that everybody has to go to because that's what's available.
Thank you, Craig. That was great. Pat, the reason why I was jumping in there was to ask was that I know that in the past, and I think this goes for all the state associations that are it's really through the state association that the stations get access to the DHS letters and the access letters, the fuel letters, that sort of thing. Is that correct? I know in the past, FAB is the one that's been distributing those.
Yes, we work with Lisa and her staff. They get them to us, and then they work with FEMA and DHS to get them from them, and then it passes through us, and then we get them out to all the stations. It's a great system. Absolutely.
Well, that's a good segue actually to Lisa and Christina and what's going on at the FCC. For starters, I want to mention many of the broadcasters who are listening already know that the FCC has come out with a few COVID-related initiatives to help broadcasters during the COVID pandemic, including the ability to donate commercial time to say the CDC or public health authorities to run PSAs without having to deal with some of the complexities of the sponsorship ID requirements. Likewise, because the pandemic is happening during election year, when the early days of the shutdown came along and commercial advertisers were canceling out, commercial broadcasters wanted to be able to basically give free airtime to some of their commercial advertising just to kind of maintain the good relationship and the goodwill. But of course, there was a concern that would impact lowest unit rate issues for political broadcasting. And the FCC has given a temporary waiver on those types of free spots, provided that they're not associated with any existing commercial contract for pay time, or that they're not bonus spots. And likewise, they lifted the pre-filing announcements for those stations that are going through license renewals. And Florida just did their television license renewals, but other states that are, and Puerto Rico as well. But I know like Louisiana, Mississippi, and those have those coming up. So to keep in mind. But Lisa, perhaps you can sort of, and Christina as well, obviously give us a feel for what's going on at the FCC's Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau and some of the initiatives that you're engaged in and your role. I know, as I mentioned earlier, you guys have just been phenomenal with working with broadcasters. I remember again, the Puerto Rico broadcast you're on, the days after Maria, being on a phone call with you guys while somebody was driving the island to see what stations were on the air and what stations were knocked out. So it's really been hands-on involvement. Tell us a little bit about what you guys are doing.
Thanks, Frank. And first of all, let me thank you and Davina for inviting Christina and I to participate in this webinar. Just to give you a quick overview of what the FCC's role is, one in alerting and then in disaster response. With respect to alerting, whether we're talking about the emergency alert system or the wireless emergency alert system, which is the mobile phone system, the FCC adopts rules that address the technical and operational aspects that will govern how communication service providers will participate in that system. So, for example, the EAS requirements that were discussed earlier that apply to broadcasters as well as other communication service providers that are required to participate in the emergency alert system. The FCC does not have authority over alert originators. I find myself having to say that several times every year since Hawaii. The FCC is, while we work with FEMA and alert originators as well as other stakeholders to conduct outreach, to develop best practices, we don't regulate the alert originators. That means that when somebody says to me, well, why wasn't the EAS activated for such an event? I have to say, well, the FCC is the wrong agency for you to ask that question. You really ought to talk to the alert originators on the ground to find out why they decided to or not activate the EAS. We also don't approve alerts before they go out. We also don't issue alerts themselves. So our role is exclusively overseeing the EAS participant, the communication service provider's role in the emergency alert system. And similarly, we oversee wireless providers' role with respect to wireless emergency alerts, although we work very closely with FEMA. With disaster management, the disaster response, just to give a quick overview of what our role there is because a lot of people are, if you ask most people what our role is, they would probably not be completely accurate. The federal government's role with respect to responding to a disaster is governed by the National Response Plan or framework. Under that plan, for communications related emergency response, the Department of Homeland Security has the primary role. The FCC works in support of DHS's role. So we work very closely. We oftentimes, with DHS, we oftentimes act as a liaison between communication service providers and the Department of Homeland Security, particularly FEMA. If there's a situation such as a broadcaster who's operating on generator power and they need fuel, or they need some type of documentation from DHS giving them permission to access their facilities if their facilities are in the disaster impact area. We also serve as the hub for collection and analysis of information regarding the situational awareness of communication service providers during times of disaster. And the mechanism by which we do that is called the Disaster Information Reporting System. And what that system is, it's a voluntary system that allows communication service providers who are registered participants in the system to let us know what their status is. And what typically happens is we work with FEMA to determine what are the areas, where do we think the disaster is going to have the most impact. And we, by county, will list out what areas we want the disaster information reporting system activation to cover. We then issue public notices, emails out to people who are already registered to participate in the system, letting them know DERS is now activated for these areas. We want to get the first reports. Usually it's the next day. We ask participating communication service providers to submit reports on a daily basis. We take that information, analyze it, and then send a report to the Department of Homeland Security. And in the last few years, we've also been issuing a public report that contains aggregated information. Why should broadcasters participate? First of all, it helps us help broadcasters in the sense that if we and DHS know that there are a number of broadcast stations that are out, we can then work with DHS to focus resources to those broadcast stations. If we know that a broadcast station is, as I said, operating on generator power and they're about to run out of fuel, that's something that DHS can then try to direct fuel resources to that broadcast station. The broadcast station can also use DERS to specifically request assistance or additional resources or other assistance through that system. So basically it helps us know what your status is if you're in the disaster impact area and what resources you need to either keep you operational or to help you get back into operation. Now, let me say that there have been times, and I remember Hurricane Maria was one of those times when DHS had to prioritize where they were going to send their resources. And that included broadcasters. The decision was made, we can't help everyone at once. So one of the ways in which they prioritized was if a broadcaster performed a stated role in the emergency alert system. So for example, if you were a primary entry point station, if you were local primary or state primary, you might be prioritized to receive assistance over a broadcast station that did not fulfill those roles. So certainly that's one way where we would tend to prioritize. I understand that for a number of broadcast stations, if your competitor is up and running, you want to be up and running as well. And I actually had broadcast stations when I said, well, do you fulfill a special role? And the answer I got was yes. And I said, okay, what is your special public safety role? Well, I'm my service area is only network affiliate, and my competing network affiliate is operational. While we understand that from that broadcaster's perspective, that's an important distinction, it really doesn't go to a public safety need or perspective. And if we're in a situation where the disaster, whether it's a hurricane or a tornado or wildfire, where the feeling is we've got limited resources, we need to start prioritizing where we send our resources, you really need to think of a real public safety need. And as I said, a specific role in your state EAS plan for the emergency alert system is certainly one way, and is certainly a public safety role that I won't say in every case, but if we need to prioritize, that's one way in which we will prioritize. In addition to the disaster information reporting system, other ways that we help broadcasters, the FCC's Public Safety Bureau has a 24/7 FCC Operations Center. And you can call, they are open. There's at least one agent there 365 days a year, on holidays, on weekends. So if a broadcast station is facing an emergency, particularly if we're in a disaster event, and they need, it's after hours and they need a special temporary authority to increase their power or whatever, you would call the operations center. The operations center would, once office will go on ahead and act on your STA request, and will notify the media bureau once our offices are open. Whenever there's a hurricane or a major disaster, the FCC will always create a website that you can go to, and it's usually the name of the event. And you can find where you can submit information to the disaster information reporting system. You'll usually see a reminder from a public notice reminding people that the Ops Center is available. We also issue public notices listing out the contact information for every bureau, every policy bureau in the agency, in addition to public safety, so that you will know where to go to if you need regulatory relief. So those are the main ways in which, during a disaster, we work with DHS and we work to support broadcasters and other communication service providers. And I'm going to turn it over to Christina to talk about EAS improvements.
Thanks, Lisa. Hi, everybody. So I'm going to talk about 4 principal improvements, new developments in EAS. The first is multilingual alerting. I know Davinia touched on that. EAS alerts initiated using the broadcast system can now include multilingual audio messages. The length of that audio message, both the English and the non-English portions, should be under 90 seconds. Keep in mind that the entire message will be sent with both the English and the non-English to the audience. Alerts initiated for distribution over iPause, they can include up to 1,800 characters of English and non-English languages. I wanted to also really encourage the broadcasters to reach out to your local emergency managers. You guys are the first informers. We've heard this over and over throughout the presentation. You know your community. Please help us do better in the multilingual alert area. We have folks that don't speak English. That's a reality. Those folks are in our communities, but during an emergency, those folks need to get the same information everybody else is getting. We've got a very helpful resource on the Commission's webpage. It's tips for alert originators to use in coming up with avenues to reach out and actually use multilingual alerts for both EAS and WEAs. And I really encourage you to reach out to your local communities, your emergency managers, the alert originators, and mention that resource is available. We also, last June 2019, had a workshop on multilingual availability and alerting. And that workshop is, there's a link to that workshop available on the Commission's webpage. Incredibly helpful resource. I think it was Francesco Sanchez, who was one of the panelists in that workshop. He had a very helpful tip. You know, we have to start where we are. One of the tips he suggested is to create, you know, in non-emergency situations when things are quiet and peaceful, which is not now, to create some scripts, some basic alerting messages in other languages, in Spanish, in languages that are critical for your community. and have those available, have those at the ready. And alert originators can do that. And we encourage you to reach out to your local communities and have them make those efforts. The other couple improvements I want to talk about, live code EAS tests. Those are available and they can help increase proficiency of alerting officials, and they can also help educate the public about EAS and the sounds, the tones that they can expect. If it's technically feasible, we ask you to include tests in the test messages that you're sending out. We also suggest that you file a notice of your tests that are proposed in our docket, FCC docket, the 1594. We request that you provide the public with plenty of notice, at least 2 weeks, and that you also coordinate with your state and local authorities, and you reach out to other EAS participants in your areas. The procedures allow broadcasters to participate in 2 live EAS tests per calendar year, and that's all I have to say about that. There's also public service announcements, which are now permitted. EAS participants can issue authorized public service announcements about the EAS. These PSAs can also raise public awareness about EAS, get the public familiar with the EAS tones again, and it can include the system's attention signal, which is the attention-grabbing 8-second 2-tone audio signal that precedes the alert message, and FEMA's simulated header code tones. Those are the 3 tones that precede the attention signal. It does not permit use of the live header code. That could have unintended consequences like triggering a false alert, or it could accidentally activate EAS equipment that may be monitoring the station. But this is a very effective tool, again, to get the public familiar with EAS. And then the last topic I'll touch on, and Davina already touched on this, it's preventing false alerts. The Commission's rules now require broadcasters to report false alerts to the Commission within 24 hours. You would send an email to the FCC Ops Center, and that is all caps FCC Ops, FCC OPS at fcc.gov with any event information and any details that you have concerning that false alert event. And now, we do have questions occasionally about this. There is no need to report on an alert if you have no actual knowledge that your station sent a false alert. Sometimes there's confusion. We get a complaint from the public that there was a false alert. It's actually not a false alert. And we have broadcasters reach out to us and ask if they need to file a report. There's no need to file a report if you have no knowledge of an actual false alert. That's all I've got for you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Christina. I really appreciate it. We're on the home stretch here, and just on to the last slide, Joe. I'm just going to wrap up a few things here. A lot of this we've already touched on, Pat, as far as how the Commission, the FCC, has automated the state EAS plans, how they are maintaining the an electronic database of all the plans, which kind of needs to have some updating is required. And then the Commission's rules on streamlining the state EAS plans. Do you have any closing thoughts, or just sort of general overview, big pictures on the issue of the state plans and where Florida is and all that?
No, I think it's, I think we're in good shape. We went over it earlier, so I'm not going to go back through the details. And I understand Lisa and Christina's issue of getting these things approved, but if we have to lose a primary station in one market, we'll get it replaced. But we've enjoyed working with them. It's working much better than it did. I mean, I go back to when there wasn't an EAS office until after 9/11. We shut down there back in the mid-90s. And it came back obviously after 9/11. But no, I think our state plan is still one of the models in the country, and we've got great support at the local level. My only final comment would be, and you were talking about the Sage equipment earlier, or anybody's equipment for EAS. I can tell you one thing, general managers understand that the engineers, outside of the general manager keeping the ship afloat and keeping it running, the broadcast engineers are the most critical people we've got, and they're extremely important. Unfortunately, they're becoming an aging group, so we need to train more broadcast engineers. But just one final COVID note, as you know, some companies were cutting staffs and all that. So one of the top CEOs of one of the broadcast companies told all their general managers, find cuts. Guy wrote back and was going to cut 2 out of the 3 engineers on his staff running multiple TV stations out west. The guy said, are you insane? No, those are sacred. You can't touch them. So I think we all need to appreciate what the broadcast engineers do. But Frank,
Yeah,
we probably need to wrap this thing up in a second. We're already at 1:20, and I think it's been a great seminar. Thank you.
It has been. And we have a lot of broadcast engineers that are tuned in today, and I hope they've gotten something out of this. We are pretty much almost out of time here. I'll try to take 1 or 2 of these questions before we close it out. But I guess there's, and you have everybody's contact information there. But this one actually was for Lisa, you and Christine, which is, and you may have already touched on this, as far as your criteria for approving state plans.
Christine, I'll turn to you on that one.
Yes. So we have a template that we use in-house, and we also work very closely with the SECCs. We, as we're working through the plan, we often have a number of questions that come up, and you know, it's a case-by-case basis. Each plan is unique unto itself, and fortunately, there's some similarities between plans, but each plan is, you know, a unique document unto itself and requires very thorough, very careful processing on our part. We use extensive staff resources to review and run things to ground very often. But hopefully that gives you what you were looking for, Frank.
And here's another, do you have information, like do you have on the operations center, the 24/7 operations center, do you have a phone number that you might be able to say, or that they can have access to?
It's 202-418-1122. And as Lisa mentioned, they're staffed 24/7, 365 days a week. And just anecdotally, I mean, that team is fantastic. They ended up getting water to a station that they were getting ready to run out of water. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that this team will do. They're incredible.
And you said it's
202-418-1122. 1122.
And then lastly, we have way too many questions here that we can answer them all. So I'm afraid there's going to be some of you that we're not going to be able to get to.
Frank, if they'll write us, we'll be glad to forward them to whoever needs the question answered.
Absolutely. But on the bilingual EAS workshop, is that available online on the SEC's website?
It sure is. And if folks are having trouble finding it, my telephone numbers and my email's right there. I'm happy to guide them if they want to reach out to me. But it's available right on the FCC's webpage. If you just go to the webpage and type in the search function multilingual or multilingual workshop, it should pull it up for you. It was last June 2019.
All right, that's great. All right, well, with that, I think we're running out of time here, but I want to thank all the participants on this this panel. Thank Lisa and Christina, as well as you, Craig, and of course you, Pat. And I also want to give a big shout out to my colleague, Davina Sashkin. And throughout the presentation, some of you have heard us saying, next slide, Joe. That's a reference to the man behind the screen, Joe Pottishman, who helps us produce these webinars. He's our marketing director at the firm. So thank you, Joe, for everything that you do. I hope you all enjoyed this. And there's our contact information. I apologize if we weren't able to get to your questions, but please go ahead and feel free to reach out. And we hope to see you at the next webinars, and enjoy the rest of your day.